Noswaith dda pawb, a croeso i'r sesiwn yma sydd yn canolbwyntio ar dysgu o radicaliaeth Llafur Cymru. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Socialist Campaign Group session, which is focusing on learning from the Welsh Labour radical agenda. My name is Beth Winter, and I'm the Member of Parliament for Cynon Valley in South Wales, and it really is an honour to be chairing this session. We've got 6 very esteemed speakers from a range of organisations and politicians in Wales. I'm going to begin the session by making a few introductory comments before handing over to the speakers, who will have approximately 6 minutes to speak. And after all the speakers are finished, hopefully we'll have time for questions and answers. And please use the Q&A function and chat to make any comments or raise any queries that you have. So diolch yn fawr. So I just want to begin by saying that Wales really does have a very strong history of radicalism and socialist thinking, and has led the way in the UK on a number of campaigns and actions, from the Chartist movement to the establishment of the National Health Service and our strong internationalism. And Wales really can remain very proud of its international commitment, with our determination to be a nation of sanctuary. We can also be very proud, I feel, of our consistent support for trade unionism and workers' rights. And all this remains particularly relevant today. In fact, it seems to be growing in importance daily, under the attacks on our living standards and our democratic rights by this Tory government. And this year marks a significant milestone in the history of the Labour movement in Wales, with it being the centenary llafur cant of Labour majority in democratic elections in Wales. This really does remain a unique achievement in any mature democracy and is rightly being celebrated. Since the establishment of the National Assembly for Wales, now called the Senedd, we've always had a Labour-led government, the only country to do so in the United Kingdom. And last year's Senedd election results were positive for Labour in Wales, and with the progressive policies of Welsh Government still in mind, Welsh voters stuck with Labour to deliver the best local election results this May for the party in years, and showed a difference between Labour in Wales and the rest of the United Kingdom. I do just want to comment here, however, on the need for us to work towards ensuring that the people of Wales feel involved and participate in the democratic process. So when people ask what the Labour government would do differently to the Tories, the answer in Wales is easy. We've retained a largely publicly owned NHS. We didn't go down the PFI route. We've got free prescriptions. We've banned fracking. We're the only nation to have a Future Generations Commissioner. 16 and 17-year-olds can now vote in elections. And we've got a climate assembly. So we've got lots and lots to be very, very proud of here in Wales. And Welsh Government will soon be delivering free school meals to all Welsh primary school pupils. The real living wage has now been delivered for care workers, and there will be a basic income pilot for care leavers in Wales starting this year. The recently announced cooperation agreement as well between Plaid Cymru and Labour to bring radical policies into being in Wales is very welcome, putting the interests of Welsh people before those of narrow party lines. This, for me, is what grown-up politics is about. And given the recent events in France, I would suggest shows the need to consider further collaboration between progressive parties to ensure the interests of the people of Wales are addressed. Lessons can be learned from the success of Welsh Labour, which was underpinned by the commitment to the principles of social justice, equality and democracy. And our First Minister, Mark Drakeford, makes no secret of his left politics. He can be credited for coining the slogan "Clear Red Water" to describe the distinctive flavour of Welsh politics. And this evening's session is going to be focusing on looking how we in Wales, but also people in the rest of the United Kingdom, can learn from our Welsh radical agenda. So like I said, we have 6 speakers this evening looking at different aspects of this agenda. So first up, we have Jack Sargeant, Member of Assembly for Allen and Deeside. An engineer by trade, Jack became the youngest ever member of the Senedd when he was elected in 2018. He is chair of the Senedd Petitions Committee and has been a key advocate in Wales for policies such as universal basic income and a 4-day week. And we've asked Jack to focus on radical policies such as UBI that he's been involved with and the Welsh Government have pursued. So over to you, Jack. Diolch yn fawr.
Well, Beth, diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you for that extremely kind introduction here. And just to thank everyone who's joined us, over 100 people joining us, like-minded individuals. What a fantastic opportunity it is for me to be able to speak to you all today. And it's about a subject, I think, that is close to all of our hearts, isn't it? It's about what Labour can do and can deliver when in power. And as you say, I'm as well so proud of the bold agenda that we are setting here in Wales. And I will focus my contribution this evening on what the Welsh Labour government are delivering, and also maybe a little bit about my own work as an individual member and as chair of the Senedd Petitions Committee. As the chair has said, last year was the best Senedd elections we've ever seen in Wales for Labour. And let's just consider for a second what that actually means. On that day, we struggled throughout the parts of the United Kingdom. We lost a parliamentary by-election in a previously what we would call a safe seat. And also let's reflect on the power of Labour in Wales, and that has been 23 years last year. So when we think of all those things, the result is even more remarkable. And again, as Beth has said, that has moved and stuck in the local elections we've just seen. So why is that the case? Well, it's the case because we won and stood on a bold manifesto, a manifesto that was about improving people's lives. And we were brave enough to be different. And I believe it worked. But the Labour Party has been a vehicle, hasn't it? We know it has, for almost all of the positive change we have seen as a country for over 100 years now. And we should never be afraid of being bold, nor be too shy to set out a bold programme. So, Beth, I will focus on 2 areas in particular of the Welsh Labour government's set up a mission to change Wales, and that will be the trial of a universal basic income. But also, I'm briefly going to touch on the opening of a network of community bank branches, and then if I have time and you'll indulge me, I'll move on to talk about public sector pension disinvestment and a 4-day week. So, for context, to those who don't know me, I represent a constituency in the northeast of Wales, one that is built on industry and manufacturing. And we have a proud history of steel making and high-skilled manufacturing, particularly in the aerospace sector. But we are a community that has seen firsthand what happens when politicians are unable to protect people from change. Shot and Steelworks in my constituency, just down the road from where I live, saw the single biggest mass redundancy in Western Europe in the 80s. Thousands of people lost their job in a single moment under a Thatcher-led Conservative government. And I mention that, colleagues, today because it's my belief that the challenges we face today are potentially much more severe than those we faced in the time of deindustrialisation. So what are those challenges? Poverty, growing inequality, a horribly precarious jobs market, the coronavirus recovery, and environmental catastrophe, to name just a few. And to add that, the unstable world where dangerous actors make decisions that impact us all. And colleagues, we also face unknowns, which I, as an engineer, see as opportunities in automation and artificial intelligence. So we have to recognise that even before COVID, but especially now, people and communities were really struggling. Poverty and its effects were growing rapidly. So let's take a second to reflect on what that means, because we say it so often, some of us sometimes forget. The scourge of poverty damaging people's lives and life chances, significantly impacting their ability to be all they wish to be. Some would debate this, some have debated this with me, but the facts paint a particularly different picture, which is simply inconvenient for some to recognise, and we know who they are. Poverty, particularly in childhood, brings with it trauma that isn't easily addressed when those hit by it enter adulthood. And I'm not just talking about and reflecting here on the level of education people attain or what jobs they enter, but an even more insurmountable problem. Poverty damages physical and mental health, and this is significantly associated with risks of significant and serious childhood trauma. And there is overwhelming evidence that when people experience trauma, they cannot recover. So even in Britain, in some households where they can keep their head above the water, many are exhausted by the longest hours in Europe, very precarious work. In a labour market that is constantly changing, the focus is rightly on the need for upskilling and lifelong learning. But we must stop and ask, how is keeping up with the pace of change possible when tiredness and anxiety about work is the reality for so many? Add to this the societal crisis that we face. This is all the theatre in which policy decisions like myself and others on the call need to operate within. I'm no way fatalistic about the prospects for our country. I'm relatively optimistic. As a trained engineer, it was my job to find solutions. In policy terms, it's about a direction of travel and starting on the road to a better Wales. So I led the debate in the last Senedd term on Wales adopting a universal basic income trial. I've written extensively about it too, as many others have. I fought for it to be in our manifesto, the manifesto that we won on. And the government has now announced the trial of a universal basic income trial for a cohort of care leavers. And let's be fair, does not have a universal element, but it is not a token gesture. Participants in the trial will receive £1,600 a month, as well as significant support. And this is important because those individuals concerned will have faced significant amounts of trauma in their lives. It built on the traditions of the last Labour government in the UK, who clearly recognised that we don't live in a fair society where we all start with the same chances. And we've seen successive governments since introduce a merit element into welfare. And I get that they have done it because the debate for support is about shirkers and workers. But this language is so far removed from what we know about the reality of poverty and the impact it has on people's lives and the behaviour it has stuck. Each passing crisis we have seen a lot recently has ingrained more people in poverty. It has damaged their lives and their children's life chances. This UBI trial is about testing whether another way will work, especially with what is coming down the road. How it will work for individuals, their ability to develop choices through things like training, or for them to have the stability to be actors in their local economies without having to face the daily grind of poverty and often the very poor housing and the myriad of life problems that brings. It's also worth noting here that in Wales, we have an ambitious council house building programme. We've scrapped the right to buy. Local authorities are building council houses in their thousands, and that's with the support of our government. Now, compared to, and just briefly, because I note I'm conscious of time, Chair, and I think others may pick up on some of the other topics, such as a 4-day week and perhaps pension sector funds we might cover in questions. But I just briefly talk about community bank branches, because it may sound a little dry, but it is, in my view, however, an emblem of the sort of economy that we want and should build, one that reinvests its growth locally. And we have quite heard already about the way better procurement can transfer local economies. But what about better and more localised borrowing and investment? High street banks have had ample time to demonstrate what actors they often are, the financial crisis, but obvious it was difficult for so many small and medium-sized firms to have had in accessing credit when it's holding back communities. Branches closing down, damaging our high streets. And the bold Welsh Labour government are supporting with money, Bank Cambria, as a step towards redirecting our economic policies towards an economy more rooted in Wales, more sustainable, with a clear sense of social purpose. So, Chair, I will end there. We've got a great list of speakers who will go through some of the other things I'm sure I look forward to. But as a committee, I look forward to taking evidence just next week on a 4-day week, which of course I'd be keen to hear your views on. And also, just a heads up to all our colleagues here, I'm aware of the government will be making a statement on the universal basic income trial in 2 weeks' time, if my diary is correct. So, friends, that's enough from me. I do hope what I've tried to set out this evening, does give you the energy and has intrigued you enough to read more about what Labour's only government in the United Kingdom is doing. And of course, to convince you that bold ideas are not a barrier to electoral success. So, diolch yn fawr, and I very much look forward to hearing the next set of speakers.
Diolch yn fawr, Jack, and thank you for relaying some of your own lived experience, which clearly has driven your tireless campaigning for bold, radical policies. And I think your reference to the points about Bank Cambria are particularly timely and relevant, and does draw parallels with Welsh Government's emphasis on the foundational economy and also community wealth building, about the importance of generating and reinvesting the wealth within our own communities, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss that through the Q&A a bit more. So thank you very much, Jack. And moving swiftly on, we now have Ceri Williams, who is the Policy Officer at Wales TUC. His background includes working for Social Care Wales, British Gas and Consumer Focus Wales. And I'm hoping, Ceri, that you'll be able to speak a bit more about the Public Procurement and Social Partnership Bill and putting trade unions at the heart of politics. Over to you, Ceri. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr, Beth, and thank you very much for the invitation this evening. It's a pleasure to be here speaking with you. Yeah, that's right. I was wanting to talk to you about the Social Partnership and Public Procurement Bill, and that was published earlier this month on the 7th of June. And it opens a new chapter in the relationship between unions, government and employers. So the Social Partnership Bill represents the most significant step yet in moving. It also ensures trade unions have a strengthened role in shaping the work of government and other public bodies to achieve their mission. The bill provides a statutory basis for what has become a distinct way of bringing workers into the policy-making fold so that their interests are not eclipsed by that of their employers. And social partnership is an attempt to remedy inequality. This is especially important in Wales, as Jack was talking about the problems that we face here. So a third of children are growing up in poverty, and more than 1 in 8 workers are classed as insecure. So redressing inequalities like these should be a central role of government, and governments which exclude trade unions from being only reinforce inequalities. And on insecure work, as Jack was saying as well, the amount of tiredness and anxiety and unhappiness that leads from being in an insecure job in a precarious situation, that in itself can lead to mental health issues. So it's not the case anymore that being in a job will solve all the problems associated with poverty and stress. So that's why we want to improve the quality of work in Wales through the measures that we're taking and pressing Welsh Government to take. So the bill itself, the Social Partnership Bill, as the name suggests, it strengthens social partnership by bringing unions into decision-making. And public bodies must seek compromise or consensus with their recognised unions on their objectives and the strategic steps they will take to achieve this. And it changes the scope of the duty of the Future Generation Commissioner to monitor and assess the extent to which well-being objectives are being met, with a new emphasis on fair work. And of course, we've got the Future Generation Commissioner on our panel, so it'd be great to hear from her. So another aspect is that a social partnership council will be set up consisting of an equal number of union, employer and government representatives, and it's established by the Welsh Government to guide the process at a national level. The bill also creates a socially responsible public procurement duty to align the devolved public sector's procurement spend to statutory objectives, which include fair work. And these duties set out new requirements of socially responsible procurement and will strengthen the Welsh Government's ability to leverage its £7 billion of annual procurement spend to drive change in the private sector. So that's important public services. Unfortunately, lots outsourced in Wales as it is in England. So you think like leisure services, care is a critical one, construction projects from the government. So by bringing in stronger social rules around how that money is spent, we can to help build the new economy that Jack was talking about in terms of the emphasis on community and the foundational economy. So critics might say that social partnership brings us as unions too close to both government and employers. So we are mindful about this as a movement, and it's the reason why not all trade unions are equally enthusiastic about social partnership. And it means that as a movement, we're adopting a reflective approach to social partnership. So we consider what delivers for workers and where our efforts are best placed. And it's not to say that social partnership will always deliver everything we want or will lead to agreement on everything, but the arena that it creates already does in Wales allows us to develop the type of bold policies that Jack was talking about and our other panelists as well. So social partnership, it's the direction which our movement has adopted through our democratic process at the Trade Union Congress for Wales recently. Unions re-endorsed the social partnership approach because it's delivered for workers. So for example, in Wales, we have a government that took worker health and safety seriously in the pandemic by mandating risk assessments and putting in place a sick pay scheme for social care workers who needed to self-isolate as a direct result of existing social partnership meetings where government, unions and employers sit down and discuss the way forward. The Welsh Government recognises that lower paid workers will always bear the brunt of the cost of living crisis. And to be fair, the Welsh Government does what it can to defend workers' fundamental right to unionise and continues to invest in the Wales Union Learning Fund. And sadly, in England, the equivalent fund has been disbanded with very negative effects. So while the UK government continues to fail workers with its broken promise of an employment bill, we look forward to working with the Welsh Government to deliver this vision for stronger social partnership. The legislation is a landmark step by the Welsh Government. It recognises the role which social partnership has already played, especially in the pandemic, and builds on it to create a coherent and ambitious vision for social partnership. And as I've said, social partnership delivers for workers and their communities. It means that policymakers understand workers' interests and they have a role in shaping the decisions which impact on them. This leads to outcomes like, as I mentioned, the mandatory COVID risk assessments, and another really important example, delivered through social partnership, the real living wage for social care workers, which is being rolled out in Wales. And we hope that social partnership will deliver much more once this legislation has passed. So the bill lays the foundations for workers to be at the table when key decisions are being taken about the communities they live and work in. It's a major step, and we look forward to working with the Welsh Government to make this a reality across Wales and prove the point. You know, we're really grateful that people across Britain are listening to this and taking part in this webinar this evening. And hopefully the ideas that we're developing, trialling, working on in Wales will be applicable across Britain. And we're proving the point really that working in social partnership on a radical agenda, making sure that everybody has a voice in government is the way forward. So yeah, diolch yn fawr Beth, and I look forward to being part of the panel later on.
Thank you, Ceri. And like you said, this really is a landmark in terms of policy development in Wales, and it's something we're all, I think, extremely proud of, particularly when you compare it to what the UK government is currently doing, trying to diminish trade union rights even further, and their woeful response to the RMT's request to meet, the refusal to engage with the trade unions. The response has been absolutely appalling. So it's extremely refreshing. And like I said, a feeling of pride that the Welsh Government truly is committed to fair work for everyone. And I'm sure people on this call will watch these developments very, very closely. So thank you, Ceri. Moving on, we now have Carolyn Thomas, Member Assembly. She's a new member of the Senedd, the regional MS covering North Wales. She's been a county councillor in Flintshire since 2008 and was a cabinet member and deputy leader of Flintshire County Council until her election to the Senedd. She now chairs a cross-party group on transport and animal welfare in the Senedd, and we've asked Carolyn to speak about the radical policies that she's been campaigning for in the Senedd, including the need to establish a public energy company and for rent controls. So thank you for joining us this evening, Carolyn.
Oh, thank you, Beth. It's a real honour and privilege to be invited to speak at the event this evening. Thank you very much. The Socialist Campaign Group provides hope for members and workers across the UK at a time when the living standards of our communities continue to come under attack from the cosy neoliberal consensus which dominates in Westminster. Nowhere is this clearer at the moment than in relation to energy companies coining it in and posting outrageous profits whilst families have to decide whether to heat or eat. The difference between neoliberalism and socialism here is abundantly clear. Whilst publicly owned energy companies in France were capping rises at 4%, the UK's privatised energy companies were increasing prices by a truly eye-watering 54%, thanks to the UK government lifting that cap. The response at UK level has been predictably timid and subservient to the interest of private profit as always. Here in Wales, the Welsh Government has recognised the immediate threat posed by these hikes, was also putting plans in place to secure long-term renewable energy security. Our government has insisted on promoting the role of public ownership in the energy sector, calling for foreign-owned multinational companies to have less control of Welsh energy projects. And we recognise how popular public ownership is, and we know full well why it's so popular. Because it works. Plans for a publicly owned Welsh energy company could not only help to reduce the burden of high bills on the Welsh public, but it's also an absolute necessity in tackling climate change. Just a few months ago off the North Wales coast, 80,000 litres of oil was spewed into the sea, exactly 26 years after the Sea Empress oil spill had wrought environmental havoc on our Welsh coast. The timing simply reinforces what we all know to be true, that we must end our reliance on fossil fuels. The private sector cannot and will not deliver this. That's why it's so encouraging for socialists across the UK to see the Welsh Government recognising the problems and providing progressive, ambitious solutions. And I'd also like to talk about the housing market, which is totally out of control. Houses are viewed now as financial investments and assets, instead of a home which puts a roof over somebody's head. The rapid and unsustainable growth of a class of buy-to-let landlords since the 1980s with Margaret Thatcher hasn't done much of the progress in the conditions of tenants, as well as driving an explosion in housing prices. The increase in prices then translates to extreme hikes in rents. People who 40 years ago would have either bought a home or lived in secure and affordable council house are now forced into a private sector that works for profiteers, not ordinary people. And that is why rent controls are now essential. Again, in Wales, our government's willingness to embrace bold solutions is shown in their commitment to explore the implementation of controlling rents across the country. And we've got a white paper coming forward in the autumn to look at this. Rent control should be designed to protect tenants, but they should also discourage the sort of rampant landlordism which is a stain spreading right across the UK housing market. A home should be a human right, not an asset which is subordinated to the whims of market forces and the pursuit of profit. On these issues and on those mentioned by my comrades this evening, the left in Wales has proven time and time again that when we organise, we can achieve radical socialist solutions. And under the leadership of Mark Drakeford, we've seen firsthand the difference that a progressive socialist government can make to the lives of working people across the country. But we must not rest on our laurels. There is no time to waste in creating the prosperous and green future that our country deserves. We must continue to stand up and to occupy every space with our values, in our streets, in our communities, and in our workplaces. Because whether it's rent controls or whether it's public ownership, we will have to face down the interests of capital, who will do everything in their power to nullify, weaken, and water down our proposals. If you need inspiration, just look at how far we came. In 2017, we came within inches of electing a truly transformative socialist government in the UK. We nearly did it. And today, the left leads the government of Wales and is putting socialism into action. We have shown that we can win these battles. So let's continue to organise and work together across the United Kingdom to ensure that we win the battles of the future as well. Thank you very much. Solidarity and diolch.
Oh, thank you, Karen. That was extremely inspiring. Like you said, we have to continue to organise, particularly at the moment when we're facing the worst cost of living crisis in living memory. And it is about getting outside of what I call the bubble of Parliament and politics and building that movement from a grassroots level up. And I know that you are passionate about that yourself. So thank you very much, Carolyn. Moving swiftly on then, we've got Sophie Howe, and I'm really pleased to be welcoming Sophie to the platform this evening, who is the world's first, and I understand only, Future Generations Commissioner. Prior to this role, Sophie was Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner for South Wales, was an advisor to 2 Welsh First Ministers, and served as a councillor for 9 years in Cardiff. And Sophie's going to explain a little bit more about the Future Generations Act and about her role. And I think we'd all like to take the opportunity to thank Sophie for taking such a collaborative role in all the work that you do, because you've worked with most, if not all of us on this panel on a whole range of issues. You've got a very diverse and complex role in many respects. But anyway, I'll hand over to you to tell us more. Thanks, Sophie.
Diolch yn fawr, Beth, a noswaith dda pawb. Good evening, everyone. I mean, I think that the title of this event is fascinating, really, in terms of this consideration of a kind of radical agenda. And the things that have been described already, and perhaps I can tell you of a few more things that are happening, they are absolutely radical, but actually they're actually just common sense as well. And the minister who took this Wellbeing of Future Generations Act through the Welsh Parliament, who happens to be actually Jack Sargeant's dad, the late Carl Sargeant. So, you know, the force is strong in this one. And you can see where his aspirations and his politics are from. But Carl Sargeant described the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act as the Common Sense Act. And the reason why we're discussing this as a radical agenda is the fact that actually in all of our systems of governance and politics internationally, and I would say certainly at a UK level at the moment, sadly, common sense isn't actually that common. And so why have we legislated for common sense in Wales, and what exactly have we done? Well, Wales is the first country in the world to have legislated to protect the interests of future generations through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which was passed in 2015. And it does a number of things. So first off, it sets out this overarching principle that all of our main public institutions, so all our local authorities, our health boards, our national agencies like Public Health Wales, Natural Resources Wales, and so on, and then significantly the Welsh Government itself, must take decisions in a way which meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Again, a common sense principle, you would think, but we've only got to look at some of the big, huge intergenerational and societal challenges that we're in the midst of to understand that that principle has not been applied really anywhere in the world. So the climate emergency, the fact that the IPCC are telling us that we've got less than a decade to save the planet from, catastrophic destruction really from climate change. The fact that mostly we're not prepared for the change in demographics of our population, so the ageing population. The fact that actually the vast majority of younger people in the future will be concentrated in the global south, and therefore how are we interacting and how are our policies affecting people in other parts of the world. The change in nature of work, and Jack's talked about the fact that his focus, and this has been something that I've been championing as well, both in terms of a universal basic income and a reduced working week. Really important things for us to be considering in terms of responses before it becomes hugely problematic to that change in nature of work. Arguably, we're on the cusp of this being hugely problematic already, but our future trends and scenarios are telling us that going into a job which is a job for life or the same sort of sector for life is unlikely to be what our future generations are doing. Our future trends and scenarios are telling us that mental health, the trajectory there is hugely problematic. So actually we do need to be focusing on things which are going to prevent poor mental health occurring. And the welfare state as it is at the moment is not accounting for 0 hours contracts and the gig economy and all of these things. So radical solutions like a UBI and like a reduction in the working week to enable people perhaps to do more in their communities, to enable them to care for our ageing population, to enable them to focus on their own well-being, to stave off mental health challenges in the future, again, isn't actually that radical or shouldn't be seen as that radical. It's just actually common sense. Just in terms of some of the broader things that the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act covers, again, you wouldn't think that it was radical for a country to have a set of long-term goals, but that's what our Future Generations Act sets out, 7 interconnected wellbeing goals, and all of our public bodies are required to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all 7 of those goals, and then take all reasonable steps to meet them. And if I just pull out one aspect or one definition of the 7 wellbeing goals, which cover prosperity, ecological resilience, a healthier Wales, a more equal Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, and a globally responsible Wales. But if we just look at the definition of a prosperous Wales, it talks of a productive, innovative, low carbon society, one which uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change, and one which develops a well-educated population with the skills to enable them to access decent work. So just pick out those key words, or if you like, pick out the emission of GDP. And there is something fundamental there about the Welsh approach to wellbeing economics, which is now enshrined in law, that actually what we need to be doing is focusing on the end game being for government, politics, policy to secure the well-being of people and planet, not the continued growth and profit of the few. And if we just look at some of the things that happened internationally during COVID, huge numbers, huge swathes of people dropped into poverty, but actually over a 5 million increase in the number of millionaires across the world, billionaires seeing their fortunes rise by 27%. And global poverty going up from 7.8% to 9.1%. So that is the consequence of our insatiable quest for growth and a focus on growth above anything else. And that is one of the things that our Future Generations Act and our long-term goals are trying to tackle in Wales. Now, as I said, you wouldn't think it was revolutionary or radical to have a set of long-term goals, but actually it is, because there's no other country in the world that has set out in law a set of long-term goals that their government, whatever colour their governments may be, are required legally to work towards. Because in every other country, we bounce from one parliamentary term to the next. And so therefore, is it any wonder why we've never really got to grips with these long-term issues like climate change, like change in demographics, demographics, like the ageing population and like the changing nature of work. And that's what makes what we're doing in Wales so exciting. So you may say that, okay, you know, a Future Generations Act, and, you know, I've been all over the world because the eyes of the world really are on Wales in terms of what we're doing with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And just to say, if you ever think that you're too small to make a difference, Wales is a nation of just over 3 million people. Our Future Generations Act is internationally renowned, and the work that we've been doing to showcase the difference that it's making has already been picked up by the United Nations, and the UN Secretary-General announced a couple of months back that at a UN level they will follow Wales's lead and have a declaration on future generations planned to come into force in 2023. The appointment of a UN Special Envoy for Future Generations and reforms to the UN's own governance infrastructure. So as I said, if you ever think you're too small, look at us, a small nation of just over 3 million people who are influencing policy on a global scale because it's radical and because it's common sense. So what is actually happening as a result of the Future Generations Act and these requirements to think and act differently? Well, if we just look at one big issue that we're facing, the big issue around climate change, and of course, this is an issue which our future generations are calling us out on. They're calling out current decision makers to say, you haven't been acting in our interest, you've been discounting our interests, in fact. Let's just look at some of the differences. And I'm not here to advocate for any particular political party. I'm an independent commissioner. But if you look at the differences between what's happening in Wales as compared to what's happening in England, and I would say there's actually some really good stuff going on in Scotland as well. If we just look at issues around mobility and transport. So recently in the last budget, the UK government have invested £27 billion in the construction of over 4,000 miles of new roads. That is against the backdrop of a climate emergency and the backdrop of around between 14 and 70% of our emissions coming from transport. What is happening in Wales? Instead of investing in road, we're cancelling road building schemes because of the climate emergency. We've seen a shift in investment from 2/3 of our infrastructure investment going into building roads down to 1/3. And where is that money going? It's going into public transport and active travel. Why is that so important? Well, if you look at a case in point of the case of the M4 around Newport, 25% of the lowest income families in that area don't even own a car. So when we invest in roads, not only are we increasing our carbon emissions and increasing the plight of people living in poor air quality and air pollution, but we're also essentially saying to those lowest income families, we're not investing in the things that are going to help you be mobile and the things that can help you get around, but we're going to be investing in the things that benefit the already well off. If we look at some of the things around investment and budget on climate change more generally, so in the 2022 spring budget, net zero was mentioned just once in the UK government's budget document, and climate mentioned 3 times. Compare that to Welsh Government policy, where what we saw in terms of investment was 59% of the overall Welsh Government capital budget going into the newly formed Climate Ministry, which has all of the levers to tackle climate change: housing, planning, transport and energy. If we look at the fact that the UK government are putting £10 billion worth of new investment into fossil fuel industries, and then sorry, this is going to sound like the Jack Sargeant fan club here, but if we look then at the fact that Jack Sargeant led a motion in the Senedd to divest from fossil fuels from our pension funds, again, you can see that distinctive difference. And that is going right, and sorry, and the final thing I'll say on climate, although I could say a lot more, if you look at the fact that in every other one of the UK nations during COVID, recycling rates went down, in Wales they went up. And so in Wales, we are the 3rd best country in the world for our rates of recycling. and our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is not just requiring us to do better at recycling, it's requiring us to make the connections between moving to a circular economy, tackling poverty, reducing inequality. So the sorts of things that you'll see in our Beyond Recycling strategy in Wales is the connections between community recycling, community repair shops, community library of things where we can borrow things instead of buying them. And why is that so important? Because we've got a loneliness epidemic on our hands as well, and because we want connected communities through our Wales of Cohesive Communities goal, and because we want to tackle income insecurity and poverty by enabling people to borrow things and recycle things and reuse things rather than buy them. Just a couple of other key areas then that have changed as a result of the Future Generations Act. Our schools curriculum, arguably nothing more important than the way in which we equip our children for later life. And I like to describe the difference in our curriculum, our new curriculum in Wales, as compared to other parts of the UK, as less Latin and more life. Because our new curriculum is based around some really key principles. What we're trying to create with our young learners in Wales is we want them to be ambitious and capable learners. We want them to be enterprising and creative contributors. We want them to be ethical and informed citizens and healthy and confident individuals. So everything that is happening in our school system now is moving away from rote learning and actually designed to enable us, our school system, to equip our young people with those critical skills for the future. And if you look at anything from how that impacts on health to what employers are saying about the skills that people have or don't have coming out of the education system, or even if you look at the sorts of skills that we need our young people to have to be able to solve some of these big societal challenges, all of the international experts will tell you it's based on empathy, it's based on teamwork, it's based on being creative, it's based on critical thinking, and it is about this holistic approach to not just educating a child to go into another whatever job, but actually helping them to have a life well lived. So I think that whilst I'm talking about a common sense agenda, sadly, in some ways, it is seen as a radical agenda. And I am proud to live in a Wales where we do have this radical agenda. I'm not always kind to the government, and often I am giving them a prod, as it, is my role to do as the Future Generations Commissioner. But let's just end on the fact that it's a brave and radical government even who will appoint someone independent to oversee what they're doing, to call them out when they might be getting it wrong in the interests of future generations, and to take that concept to the rest of the world.
Thank you, Sophie. And we could really feel your passion and determination. Then you really have made such a significant difference in influencing the policy agenda. And like you said, who can disagree with the fact that whatever we do for current generations, it shouldn't compromise future generations. And that is indeed a common sense approach. Before we move on to the next speaker, I just want to thank people for all their comments and questions. We've had a lot of questions coming in. We will have a brief time at the end to cover some of those. And we are joined by people from all over the UK and further afield. Many people from Wales, Ogmore, Cardiff, Cynon Valley, Finchshire and Avon Valley, but also from Oxford, Essex, South East London, Sheffield, Warrington, and apparently we're joined by somebody from as far afield as Indonesia. So it's really encouraging that we're able to get our Welsh radical vision out there internationally, because we are, as I said at the outset, internationalists in Wales. So moving on, I would like to introduce Darren Williams, who is a friend and has been very much a mentor to me since being elected. He's a secretary of Welsh Labour Grassroots, which is the organisation of the left in Wales, the equivalent of Momentum. He's also senior officer at PCS Union in Wales and has sat on the Welsh Labour Executive Committee since 2016. Darren, welcome.
Diolch, Beth. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak at this meeting. And can I say as well, it's great to see you chairing this meeting, because you are very much in the best traditions of the Welsh left that you talked about at the start. of tonight's meeting. I'm really pleased that we have this opportunity for comrades across Britain and further afield to learn from some of the lessons of the Welsh experience, because I think in the past Wales has tended to be somewhat overlooked, and I think recent experience has changed that, and that can only be a positive thing. So Beth, you talked about clear red water at the beginning. That phrase, of course, came from a speech by Rhodri Morgan, who was First Minister for several years early in the devolution period in Wales. The speech was written, of course, by Mark Drakeford, but that phrase of clear red water, I think, demonstrated the direction in which the Welsh Labour Party was determined to take Wales. At the time, under the leadership of Tony Blair at a UK level, we saw the kind of, if you like, the high watermark of Blairism of New Labour, with an increasing gap between the rich and poor, privatisation and market forces being used supposedly to reform public services. We'd already seen one war in Afghanistan, and we were moving quickly towards another in Iraq. And all the time, of course, the UK party leadership was shutting down democracy within Labour. So Wales's response to that, Wales's alternative, was to reject privatisation and marketisation of public services, to put equality of outcome, not just equality of opportunity, at the heart of our political programme, and really to make that drive everything. So we saw the scrapping of the internal market in the National Health Service, we saw free NHS prescriptions, and many of the other policies that people have referred to. And of course, Mark Drakeford, as Rhodri's policy chief, was the architect of that programme. And that's proven popular throughout the 23 years of democratic devolution in Wales. It's meant that Labour has kept winning, that Labour has still led governments throughout that entire period. And the policies have kept coming. People have mentioned some of them, but Wales led the way with the smoking ban in enclosed public places, in presumed consent for organ donation, both policies that have saved many, many lives. We've had more recently protection of children from physical punishment. We've seen the end of the right to buy council houses, which people have mentioned, and of course, the Welfare of Future Generations Act, which Sophie was just talking about. So Welsh Labour Grassroots, the organisation of which I'm the secretary, was formed in 2003 to oppose the Blair onslaught, the kind of neoliberal agenda of the UK leadership at that time, but more positively to support what the Welsh Labour leadership was starting somewhat tentatively then to do, and to try and push it further in that kind of bold and radical direction, but also to address the democratic deficit in the party, which was as much of an issue here in Wales as indeed it has been throughout the rest of the Labour Party. And when Jeremy Corbyn ran for leader the first time in 2015, it was Welsh Labour Grassroots members as much as anyone who organised his campaign here in Wales. And of course, after Momentum was established after that leadership election, we linked up with Momentum and continued to work with them, as we do with other groups on the left like CLPD and so on. In 2017, when the Welsh Labour Party was given the ability to choose how to elect its own leader for the first time, the kind of more conservative forces within the party attempted to impose an electoral college rather than one member, one vote, which was what the majority of members wanted. We led a campaign that succeeded in a few months in overturning that decision and in instituting OMOV elections for the leader and deputy leader. And Mark Drakeford, who was a strong supporter of that OMOV policy as an assembly member by that time, was of course elected under an OMOV system at the end of 2018. And Mark made his platform for leadership about those kind of radical policies that he'd always championed, but also about democracy within the Labour Party, the Labour movement, and indeed in Welsh society. And we continue to see advances in the party. So things like the Welsh seat on the National Executive Committee, which was previously in the gift of the Welsh Party leader, now being elected by OMOV. And in society, we've seen a push for greater democracy and autonomy. There's been growing support for a deeper devolution, for more autonomy for Wales, in some quarters even for independence. And that reflects to a large extent that commitment to democracy and the fact that Wales has been proven to be moving in a progressive direction that people can identify with. So we saw a kind of high water mark really for the left when Mark became leader in Wales and Jeremy Corbyn was still leader at a UK level. Unfortunately, of course, we lost Jeremy a year or so later, and the party has kind of rode back subsequently from the progressive, exciting policies that we saw in two general election manifestos. But Wales has continued to carry the flag for a radical agenda, and that has really paid off. And I think the COVID pandemic has also demonstrated more than anything else, probably, the real difference it makes in having a progressive government, a progressive, left of centre Labour government dealing with major crises that affect people's lives, rather than the, corrupt and irresponsible leadership or lack of leadership that we've seen at a UK level. And as much as anything, I think that contributed to the huge success that we saw in the Senedd elections last year, which people have already referred to. But in addition to that, as other speakers have said, there were some really positive policies in that manifesto. We've already heard from Ceri about the Social Partnership and Public Procurement Bill, from Carolyn and Jack about the real living wage for carers, the universal basic income pilot. There's also been, a move to expand carbon neutral social housing for rent, commitment to explore the creation of a publicly owned energy company, which Carolyn also talked about, particularly since the agreement with Plaid Cymru meant that we've got the votes in the Senedd to get those kind of policies through. So there's lots of really exciting things happening. The further announcement today about the detail of the free school meals for all primary school children, and the further move towards making Wales more democratic by expanding the Senedd so we can actually do primary legislation properly and making it elected on a more proportional basis. And those kind of policies have paid off as well, as others have said, in the local elections that we saw just at the start of last month. One policy that particularly struck a chord in those elections was Welsh Labour's commitment to introduce legislation to give local authorities the power once again to establish publicly owned and controlled municipal bus companies, reversing the Tory bus deregulation measures of the 1980s. And as I said, all these policies have fueled not only support for that progressive governmental policy agenda, but also support for deepening devolution, giving Wales more autonomy to have greater control of our own affairs. And I'm sure Mick, who is leading that work, will talk about that when he speaks in a few moments. So there is experience there we can all learn from in Wales. Unfortunately, I have to say, Keir Starmer doesn't show a great deal of interest in learning those lessons. He rarely talks about the positive achievements that Wales has had, but all of us as party members can, I think, learn those lessons, and we can hold them up as a beacon of what the left can aspire to. So when the UK party leadership says we have to be cautious and move away from radical policies to win elections, we can say, well, no, Wales, Mark Drakeford and Welsh Labour have actually succeeded in elections in continuing to stick to progressive and radical policies. When the UK leadership says we have to seek constructive engagement with the Tory government, we can say, well, no, Mark Drakeford won respect and popularity throughout the COVID pandemic by challenging Boris Johnson and the reckless conduct by the Tories of the handling of the pandemic, by challenging them at every turn. And when the UK leadership says we have to distance ourselves from the trade unions, and we have to say that strikes are harmful in the way that's been said in relation to the RMT strikes this week, we can say, well, the Welsh government has actually embraced unions as partners and involved them in policy making throughout, as Ceri and others have talked about. So I think those are the lessons that we can hold up as an example for the wider Labour Party and Labour movement. We've all got an opportunity to take those lessons forward now. We've got important internal elections taking place for positions on the National Executive, National Policy Forum and so on. And we've got an important conference coming up in the autumn. So I think we all need to campaign for candidates for those positions who are going to learn the lessons of Wales and continue to support radical policies that present a real alternative to the Tories. The Grassroots 5 candidates standing for the CLP section in the National Executive. For those of us in Wales, Lynn Jones, former Socialist Campaign Group MP, standing for the Welsh seat on the NEC. And we also have excellent candidates standing for the National Policy Forum, who will try and take our policy back to the radical ideas of the 2017 and 2019 manifestos. And we need to get motions through to conference in the autumn as well that will remind us that people actually responded so positively to those policies, particularly in 2017. Things like public ownership of the utilities and the railways, which are so clearly needed now as a solution to the cost of living crisis and all the other crises that ordinary people are facing in this country and further afield. So those are the kind of things that Welsh Labour Grassroots wants to be part of. Hopefully we can all work together on the left, everyone represented in this meeting this evening. We can fight for those policies, we can fight for greater democracy in the party and in society, and the lessons that we've seen in Wales over the last few years can be learned more widely. Thank you.
So, thank you ever so much, Darren. And yes, Wales really is a beacon of what can be achieved. And you eloquently express the need, rightly so, for us to challenge, and there's nothing wrong with having a transformative policy platform and agenda. In fact, it is needed now more than ever, and Welsh Labour Grassroots and yourself and many other comrades in the movement have played a pivotal role, in influencing Welsh Government and the progressive and radical agenda. So thank you, Darren. So last but not least is Mick Antoniw, another friend and dear comrade. Mick is the member of the Senedd for Pontypridd and has been so since 2011 and is now the Counsel-General and Minister for the Constitution to Welsh Government. And before being elected, he was a solicitor at Thompson's, a leading member of the anti-apartheid movement during the 1980s and a founding member of the Bevan Foundation. And we've asked Mick, given his role within Welsh Government, to provide us with an overview of the policy proposal set out in the programme for government. Diolch yn fawr, Mick.
Well, diolch yn fawr, Beth. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak. It's always wonderful being the 7th or 8th speaker because everyone has said just about anything and everything that could possibly be said. So I'm just really going to talk about a few reflections on the movement in Wales, why I believe we are making progress. I don't want to present a picture that somehow we are a socialist utopia in Wales and everything is wonderful and fine, but we are making progress. We are beginning to deliver and reform society and introduce radical policies. This November, we are celebrating 100th years of Welsh Labour. That is, for 100 years now, Labour has won a majority vote in elections in Wales. That is an incredible and an outstanding achievement. And I put it down to, I think, a number of things. One within Wales is the ability to stick to principles, to be radical in your beliefs, but to always carry people with you in terms of policy reform and in terms of change. You've already heard about the development of clear red water. I think that was a key watershed because at a time when we had massive electoral victories in Westminster, it was really, really important that as the sort of new Labour agenda begin to move into more conservative areas of social and welfare policy, disinclination to support trade union reform and so on, it was very clear that the link between Labour and working class communities was under strain. You know, what someone once said to me, well, you know, the working class vote, they'll always vote Labour because they won't have anywhere else to go. Well, we know that with examples with regard to Brexit and with regard to UKIP and organisations like that, that isn't the case, that you have to be continually presenting an agenda that relates to people's lives. So Clear Red Water was really a statement that we will do things differently in Wales, that we will always stand up for Welsh interests, we'll stand up for progressive policies within Wales, and we won't automatically always follow a central line if we think that contradicts with our values or it contradicts with the interests of the people of Wales. One of the important constitutional reforms that Welsh Labour did, that the new Labour did introduce, of course, was devolution. I don't think Tony Blair was ever a great fan of devolution. He inherited it from John Smith and from earlier campaigns. But devolution for me really is about the decentralisation of power. It's about subsidiarity. It's bringing power as close as possible to people in decision-making about those things that affect on their lives. So it is obviously important to Wales as it is important to Scotland in terms of national identity, in terms of language, in terms of culture. But subsidiarity and decentralisation power is equally as important in parts of England as well. And we see that in the electoral results there, the success in Manchester, Liverpool, and other areas of England where there has been developed a close identity with communities and with people, where Labour is seen to be standing up for people and communities. Then people will support it. Where Labour is seen to be on the fence, to be equivocal, then they abandon it. Wales is a country that is post-industrial. The days when you could count on every community, on the miners, on the steel workers, on the foundry workers, etc., to vote Labour, well, those communities don't exist as they once existed. People look for policies that actually give them hope, give them vision, and give them a future. And that is where Jeremy Corbyn was successful. But I would say in particular, it is also why Welsh Labour has been successful. So when we introduce policies like the Social Partnership Bill, this will be the only piece of legislation in the UK that actually creates a statutory framework for partnership between business, trade unions and government working collectively in a common interest. When we look at things coming out of devolution, for example, the Elections Act, which has been passed in the UK, which will introduce voter ID, we will not be going down that road. It does mean that Welsh Senedd, Welsh parliamentary elections will be very different to UK general elections in the future. We will not have voter ID. We'll be looking to digitise the electoral register to enable people to vote in different times, different places, in different ways, maybe online, securely and robustly, but really to give people access to the electoral system, to make it inclusive of people. So it will be a very different sort of electoral system that we're working to, on a policy of one that is about maximising people's participation in the electoral system, as opposed to the Tory one, which is about actually how do you actually restrict it? How do you change the voting system to make it more difficult for Labour candidates to succeed, or to make it easier for Tory candidates to succeed? We've looked, we have one of the important aspects as well is not being ashamed of what we are. Not being ashamed to say that we are genuinely socialist and that we believe in fairness and we believe in justice, because if we don't, then what is the purpose to us? So the fact that we have taken into public ownership our railway system, that we are looking now to integrate with regulated bus transports and taxi systems, so that transport is actually not only environmentally friendly, but is also a public service. We also, as a government, and I have to say, we need to be very aware, of course, of the limitations of devolution within Wales, because we have a right-wing Tory government that is attempting to restrict the way in which we operate, to place limits on how we operate, and to control the actual financial resources that we actually have. And that is a threat not only to devolution, but I believe it is also a threat to democracy, a centralising right-wing government. So we have, with legislation that comes to us that impacts on us, it has to have our consent in order to proceed if it affects devolved powers. We are increasingly having situations where the Tories are attempting to undermine that, are refusing to comply with the convention that they will not legislate in areas which are devolved. So socially, we have established ourselves as a nation of sanctuary, a country that welcomes refugees. My father was a refugee. We have many refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, and now from Ukraine. We are welcoming to our country and supporting them. And I think that is a statement of different values to the way in which refugees are being treated in the UK. We have to see the threat to democracy, the police crime sentencing and courts bill, the restrictions on protest, the Racist Nationality and Borders Bill, and the further attack that there is going to be by changes to the Human Rights Act, the proposed Bill of Rights, which will basically restrict the courts from challenging government when government acts unlawfully. So we have to be aware that, as the old NUM banner, National Union of Mine Workers banner, used to say, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And now is a time where, by God, we need to be vigilant. We also are well aware that the structure of the UK is unfair, resources are distributed unfairly, and democracy is unfairly distributed as well. We have within Wales set up our own Constitutional Commission. It's a Constitutional Commission to look at the relationship between Wales and the rest of the UK. It's about how we actually engage, how we actually bring decision-making and powers as close to people as possible, and how we actually democratise the relationship between ourselves and the Westminster government. This isn't a reform that is about nationalists or separatists or whatever. It's about what we as socialists have always believed in, and that is that it's about the empowerment of working people, the empowerment of communities, and establishing a democratic system that gives people the maximisation of that particular power. There are many things we'd like to do that we don't have the authority to do. Maybe we will have authority with this further devolution in the future. We'd like to do more in terms of trade unions, but employment law is reserved. That is, it is out of our bounds, as are many other social areas that we would like to engage in. But I believe we have used the powers that we have, and we continue to use them in a way that is progressive, that is radical, that is democratic, and is making a difference to people's lives in what is an incredibly difficult and a growingly difficult economic and social environment that we're in. Diolch yn fawr. Thanks, Beth.
Diolch yn fawr, Mick. And you really have and continue to have an instrumental role in the devolution and the debate around the Constitution in Wales. And you touched on the fact that you and others have really pushed back against UK government's anti-democratic and racist policies. And Welsh Government has actually withheld legislative consent in relation to a number of the bills the UK government are trying to impose on people. We really do have different values and ethos here in Wales. So thank you very, very much, Mick. We haven't got much time for questions, but we've had lots in. So I am going to select just a couple of them, but I will target the questions of people maybe who've got more expertise in these areas. So the first question, leading on actually from what Mick was talking about, is relating to PR. So Norleen and a few others have asked, what is the thinking in Welsh Labour about proportional representation? And linked to that question, Darren Williams and others are asking about the effect that the expansion of the Senedd is 96 members. How could that affect progressive cooperation agreement between Plaid, or will it affect the cooperation agreement between Plaid and Labour? So I'm going to pass that question to Mick and Darren, if that's okay. So Mick, did you want to go first?
Okay, well, I've always been a great supporter of proportional representation, and I also firmly believe that we need to work with other progressive parties if we're to overturn the Tory government and actually reform the electoral system, which has almost an inbuilt Tory majority. We have already introduced legislation which means that local governments, the new local councils elected, can within the first 2 years introduce a proportional voting system if they choose to do so. So there is an option there. We have always had a certain element of proportionality, not the best of systems, certainly an element of proportionality in the top-up system to the election of Senedd members, and that has made us, I think, more representative. But as we look to increase the size of the Senedd, which we have to do, we've moved away from an assembly to being a fully fledged parliament with increased responsibilities. We also have the opportunity through increasing the numbers to actually establish almost a statutory version of gender balance. We can actually ensure, I believe, certainly put at the forefront, gender balance and greater diversity within representation within the Senedd. And I think that is really important. We only have 60 members at the moment. There are proposals which the party will be considering to increase that number to 96 using a list system. but one that will be twinned, and that for Labour representation would introduce gender balance. Just to say, we already have a female majority in the Welsh Government, and 60% of our Senedd members are in fact female. So we've actually already achieved a high degree of gender balance. We need to increase diversity, though, in many ways, and that reform is an opportunity to do that.
Okay. Darren, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Not a great deal, Beth. I very much agree with everything Mick's just said. I'm also a long-standing supporter of proportional representation. And by the way, I'm really pleased Unison has now taken a position in favour of PR for the UK Parliament, joining a whole string of other unions, including my union, PCS, by the way, which isn't affiliated to the Labour Party, but was an early supporter of PR. I think the Senedd is moving in the right direction. The proposals that Labour implied have agreed, which Mick's just referred to, would not only give the Senedd the ability to carry out its legislative powers much more efficiently, but also, would represent a move towards a deeper kind of democracy. It'd be more proportional, and we've never had an overall majority in the Senedd or the Assembly before that since 1999. So in that respect, the proposals wouldn't change things enormously. But as Mick has said, there is the capacity for progressive parties to work together, and the agreement with Plaid demonstrates that. And I think this would just put that on a firmer basis.
Thanks, Darren. The next question is from June Simmons and a couple of others who are very interested in workers' rights and things like outsourcing. And given the imminent strike tomorrow by the RMT, it would be good to get a bit more of a flavour, if that's okay. And I target this at Ceri and Jack in terms of the distinctiveness in Wales and the approach to trade unionism and strikes. So Ceri, did you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you, Beth. No, it is a different approach here, really. We see as a trade union congress that the ministers are willing to speak to trade unions regularly, and it has a big impact then on the policies that are brought forward. So on the railways, as Mick had mentioned, it's a nationalised service now in Wales, Transport for Wales, but that wouldn't necessarily mean, was it, that you'd have good relations, but the Welsh Government insisted that the system that was set up, social partnership within the railway company itself, within Transport for Wales, employers, Transport for Wales, the Welsh Government and the unions have been sat down in quite difficult meetings over the recent years around issues about pay, especially, to be fair to the RMT, picking up issues around low-paid workers. So it's not that they're straightforward. It's not a land of milk and honey, as Mick was saying, but having that discussion face-to-face and a commitment to listen to workers' concerns has meant that Transport for Wales, workers there, RMT members, aren't in disputes with Welsh Government. They're affected by the strike, of course, because of Network Rail being out of action during strike days. So, but it shows how that practical approach of sitting down with workers makes a difference to the outcomes, to the policies. And a particularly important one that's been referred to a number of times is around social care and a commitment to introduce the real living wage for care workers. I mean, it undoes the damage, undoes some of the damage of the outsourcing of social care workers over the years, but bringing social partnership together, again, a series of difficult meetings between the huge group of outsourced employers, the trade unions representing the workers and the Welsh Government, to work out how in a practical way this could be implemented, ensuring that any extra money going into social care wasn't diverted. There's not much money around there, not much profit either, but making sure that it gets to the workers is a difficult thing. So yeah, really, I'm sorry I'm into the nitty gritty with those two things, but I wanted to make the point, it's not straightforward, but the framework the Welsh Government's putting in place makes it possible for workers to have a real influence on policies and with a real difference on the ground for people. So that was the point I was wanted to make with that detail. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Ceri. And Jack, did you want to add anything? Because obviously you've done a lot of work in terms of 4-day week and other good work initiatives.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. And just to agree, just to talk on behalf, I suppose, of the Welsh Government, and I can't speak on behalf of the Welsh Government, but I think Ceri's painted a picture there, and Mick, in his contribution, has painted a clear picture of that progressive and supportive close contact with trade unions, and the Social Partnership Bill clearly shows the government's commitment towards the trade unions. But you're right. We mentioned strikes. It wasn't that long ago where I was on a picket line in my own constituency of Allen and Deeside, and if I'm needed to be on the picket line again, then I will be standing in solidarity with my trade union colleagues. So I think I should paint that picture from the outset. But in terms of some of the ideas, the 4-day week, just for one of those ideas, these can't be achieved without the conversations with trade union colleagues. That these ideas we don't all have. I don't sit here in the office in the back bedroom with all the ideas in the world. We know that, don't we? And it's important to get the real feeling of the worker, where the policies that we have described today are going to affect the most. So just to put it into terms of where I see and some of the things I've been championing in the Senedd, if you like, the part of that is to re-tip the scale of balance towards the worker. We've seen, haven't we, for a number of years, any sort of positive change has always gone to the employer. It's time to have the conversation about supporting the worker, and I think we generally are doing that in the Senedd, both on the backbenches and also for in government, in fairness. And Mick's a champion of trade unions long before me, and it's a pleasure to work so closely with him. But the important thing for Wales is the Social Partnership Bill and getting that right, and again, leading the United Kingdom on this and showing our real force what Labour can do in government.
Thanks, Jack. And Sophie, you've also been very involved in workers' rights, and I also, so you may want to comment on that, but I also wanted to pose a question from Maggie to you about the progressive policies in consultation with people the Welsh Government have or are developing around equalities issues. And I know that's something that's also very close to your heart. So Sophie, thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, lots going on in this space, and not this isn't a sort of a new thing in a way. So the Welsh Government were that sort of took forward from the Equality Act provisions actually quite a progressive implementation of the specific equality duties, which placed more detailed requirements on institutions in Wales around reporting on equal pay and and various other aspects there. Also, more recently, then the passing of a socio-economic duty, so requirements on our institutions to demonstrate how they're considering their policies and their approaches from a socio-economic lens, which is really important. Some really good work that's happened recently around a race action plan, and I like the fact that it's called an action plan rather than a strategy. Actually led by people of colour from a whole range of different backgrounds, and really seen as quite first off, saying quite clearly that that Wales does have a problem with racism, as the whole of the UK does, and I think that sort of saying that up front is an important point. Some of the things that have been emerging from that action plan. Black history is now a mandatory part of the curriculum here in Wales, and then just looking to gender and disability. So in terms of disability plans, to embed the Convention on the Rights of Disabled People into Welsh law, but also in terms of gender, a big gender review that's taken place, some really progressive approaches to gender budgeting, still more work to do on that, but a good indicator of the direction of travel. And a few years back, Wales, way in advance of what happened actually at a UK level, implemented the first Violence Against Women, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence Act, which goes beyond just sort of focusing on the criminal justice response. Of course, Wales doesn't have responsibility around policing, but actually focuses on getting upstream of issues relating to gender-based violence, really tackling issues around perpetrators, requiring all institutions to make it their responsibility and have a strategy in place, and requiring public bodies and public services beyond the police to ask and act questions around domestic abuse and violence against women and girls. So quite a plethora of really good and quite distinctive policies, I would say. Of course, there is still inequality in Wales, and no one can rest on their laurels until that is tackled. But I think there is quite a distinctive approach here.
Yeah. Thank you, Sophie. And the last question I'm going to pose to Carolyn and Mick, if that's okay, and it's from Gethin, who asks, what's the most important lesson the UK Labour can learn from Welsh Labour's electoral success and stay true to the core and fundamental principles of the Labour movement? Carolyn?
Well, I think Mark Drakeford has led Welsh Labour excellently, but it's the progressive policies that have been in place that are deliverable, that people believe in, and I think that UK Labour can learn from those as well.
Mick?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
for me, it ultimately is about vision, belief, and hope. That you've got to have practical policies, but they've got to be based on some values of belief and hope for the future. And they've got to be based on fairness, justice, and equality. They've also got to be tied in with competence in government. That is, people know and recognise that you are competent in what you do and how you govern, but that you will govern fairly, justly, and you will represent their interests. And I think most importantly, the people actually believe you are doing something good to make their lives better. If people don't think you are making their lives in any way better, then why should they vote for you?
Thank you, Mick. And on that note, I'd like to thank all the speakers for their excellent contributions this evening. I'd also like to thank the Socialist Campaign Group and Lee and colleagues for running the evening, and also for everybody who's joined us from across the world. Just a couple of closing remarks from me, particularly at the moment, given the times that we are living in. I think the presentations this evening have really shown there is tangible policies alongside a transformative radical agenda that means voters can really see the benefits of Labour in Wales. And that is, as I started by saying, the clear red water that is red to clear red action. And this is needed now more than ever, given the authoritarian, anti-democratic and racist UK government that we have in Wales, and the cost of living crisis that is, so many people are suffering. And I spoke at the TUC conference in Wales recently and referred to this, and I truly believe this, that it is a class war, but there is an alternative. And as Mick has just said, we've got to have hope for a different future. We have to unite across different regions, backgrounds, agencies to be able to tackle this. And in the words of Mark Drakeford, develop a radical and policy agenda. I hope you will also, like myself, join the picket lines tomorrow if you're able to, showing our support and solidarity for the RMT members and workers who are fighting for all workers throughout the United Kingdom. They need our support, and above all, need to unite and challenge, as the RMT are demonstrating themselves and everybody spoken this evening, to give future generations a fairer, greener, socialist future. So let's get out there and do some politics. Diolch yn fawr, everybody. Solidarity. Hwyl fawr.